have students or if you are a student, I will simply say, I trust Connor. If you are a student, you are the church of today. This is your church. Not just someday, but today. I'm glad to be back. I've been on the road for several weeks. I'm glad to be back with you. It is good to see you. It is good to see what's going on around here. And today we are launching a new series called Free. And in the month of August, by the way, it's August. In the month of August, we're going to be looking at 4 stories from the life of Jesus under the theme of free. I spent the last 3 weeks away from home. That included a visit to the Midwest. My wife, Melissa, graduated with her master's degree. We got to see family. Yeah, me too, all right? She absolutely killed it, and it did not kill her. It was great. We got to see family, and we even got to see a thunderstorm. And I've got to tell you, they're not the same out here as they are in the Midwest. And I like storms. I like watching storms. I grew up in a Midwest farming community outside of town. There was a 100-acre field in front of my house. When a storm would come in, I used to sit out in the middle of that field, and I would watch the dark clouds roll in and collide, and that would just give me awe. And then the lightning would start, and my mom would yell at me to get inside, and I would watch as it gets closer because it was an adrenaline rush for me. But last summer, I was on the lake, and watching a storm come in was different. Whether you like storms or you fear storms, when storms are over the water, it's scary. I've spent the last few summers working at a church camp up on Cascade Lake, and the students will typically spend afternoons on the lake. And when the students are in the water, the adults are watching what's going on. So last year, I was at a middle school camp, and a storm started to come in. Students are swimming, and they're playing, and they're on boats, and they're being pulled by tubes. But a storm started to roll in, and it got scary. Lightning is a threat when you're on the water. So we started watching the sky, and people got their apps out that can track how close the lightning is getting to where we are. Wind is a threat. Wind can start rocking your boats, but wind makes the waves bigger. And how big do the waves have to get before they start getting in your boat? How big do the waves have to get before you worry about your boats tipping over? But let's be honest, the scariest thing, these boats were full of middle schoolers. And we knew they would start to panic, and that would make everything worse. So I was watching, and I was watching 2 banks of mountains and clouds rolling in from both sides. And I was watching as the lightning kept getting closer, and watching as the wind picked up. And so adults and lifeguards start immediately calculating how quick can we get everyone home. Because a storm over the lake is different. It's scary. Waves and boats, good mix for students. Big waves getting in the boat, bad mix for everyone. The disciples of Jesus experienced this. But they couldn't just motor to shore and drive home. I want you to open your Bibles with me to Mark chapter 4. And while you're turning there, book of Mark, 4th chapter, I want to give you some background from the chapters that come before. Mark chapter 3 tells of Jesus healing people and the crowds getting bigger. Sick people come to Jesus, and with a word, they're not sick anymore. And so people start coming because they want to hear Jesus speak. And in Mark 4, Jesus starts telling these crowds parables. He tells stories. He tells a story about a man sowing seed, and he says the ones who are blessed are the ones who hear the words of Jesus and it multiplies. You have heard the words of Jesus from the Bible. May I encourage you over the next month to try to hear the words of Jesus anew and maybe hear them for the first time as we look at 4 stories of Jesus together. In these parables, Jesus says, if you have a light, you don't hide it. You don't turn the flashlight on your phone and then put your hand over the top of it. That light may burn brightest here at church, but this cannot be the only place it burns. Jesus goes back and he tells more stories about seeds, and those are all about faith growing, getting bigger. He told a lot of parables. He told stories to make points about his kingdom because sometimes stories relate better than lecture does. But then Jesus decides to get in the boat. And this is not just a story to make a point. This is history. This is a story that Jesus actually experienced along with his disciples. And this is the story in Mark chapter 4, beginning in verse 35. On that day, when evening had come, he said to them, "Let's go across to the other side." And leaving the crowd, they took him with them in the boat, just as he was, and other boats were with him. And a great windstorm arose, and the waves were breaking into the boat, so that the boat was already filling. But he was in the stern, asleep on the cushion. And they woke him, and they said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" And he awoke and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Peace, be still." And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. And he said to them, "Why are you so afraid? Have you still no faith?" And they were filled with great fear and said to one another, "Who then is this that even the wind and the sea obey him?" Here are fishermen. They've been on this lake many times. They knew storms, and they knew this one was bad. The experienced fishermen were scared. The Lake of Galilee, or Sea of Galilee, is only about 8 miles wide and 13 miles long. It's in northern Israel. It's a little bigger in square footage than Lake Cascade, just north of us. It's not an ocean, but it's big enough for a thunderstorm to get scary in a hurry. The sudden storms can actually be quite violent, especially if you are in an open fishing boat with low sides. Back in 1986, they discovered a boat from the time of Jesus on the edge of the Sea of Galilee during a drought. This is very similar to the boat Jesus and the disciples would have been in. This boat is only 27 feet long, just a little bigger than most of the ski boats you would see on a lake. But it has no motor, so getting to shore is difficult. And a violent storm is producing these waves that are getting into the boat, and the experienced seamen realize that this boat could sink quickly. They aren't middle schoolers in a panic. Their fear is real. They could die, and there's nothing they can do about it. They've seen Jesus heal people, so maybe he can help, but he is asleep. What makes you that afraid? Are you scared of change? There's been a lot of change for us as a church in the last year. And more change is coming. That is the nature of things. Over time, things change. And I believe good days are ahead, but change is scary. Are you afraid of people? Adults experience this just as much as kids do. We just have better coping skills. Translation, we hide it better, but it's still there. Are you afraid of not being good enough, doing enough, just being enough for the people in your life? Fear can weigh you down like an invisible block of concrete that is always overwhelming and weighing you down. The fears are real. And whether or not you admit the fear is there, it can be overwhelming. Maybe you have fear over elections or over your family. You worry over the choices that people make or sickness that you can't control. And you look at an event that's coming and you think, if this doesn't go right, if the right choices aren't made by these people, then everything is just over. Have you ever felt just a little bit like the disciples in the boat? It's scary and you feel powerless. And Jesus? I left Jesus at church. He's in the back of the boat and he's asleep. Can you imagine what it's like to be in the boat, to be at your job, maybe even be in your home, and be absolutely terrified because you are powerless to make the situation better? And Jesus is asleep. So they come to their teacher for help. Now, it's a big deal that they call him teacher. It is no small thing that they come to their rabbi in their fear. He's been teaching the crowds, but he makes it clear that he wants his disciples to really get it. I want to back up a couple of verses before this story because the context of the chapter always matters. What happens before will help us understand this event in the boat. Remember that I said Jesus has been telling parables. He's been telling stories to make a point. And this is what he says. Look at verse 33. With many such parables, he spoke the word to them as they were able to hear it. He did not speak to them without a parable, but privately to his own disciples, he explained everything. Can I say, that's you? You are disciples. The reason I say that is because I think that's one of the reasons you are at church. You come to a church where we focus on what Acts 2 calls the apostles' teaching. We teach the Bible. Is it possible that you are here because you want to learn from Jesus? Not just about Jesus, but you want to learn from Jesus. You want to learn His ways. Not just to keep you out of trouble, but you really want to learn to follow Him. That's what it means to be a disciple. There have been crowds around Jesus. They have seen the miracles. They have heard these stories that He told. But when the storm comes in the boat, it's not about the crowd. It's about the small group. The group with Jesus that wants to learn from Him. He is their teacher, and He wants them to understand and not be lost. Is it possible to be a follower of Jesus, to have listened to His teaching, and end up in the boat where everything could go wrong? And you are afraid. I wonder if Jesus took them out in the boat to see if they were getting it. Because the specific thing keeping them from understand what Jesus has been teaching is fear. You can relate, can't you? The disciples are powerless. The water is sinking their boat, and they are afraid. But Jesus, the teacher, is asleep. And Jesus is the one with power and authority. And He wants to be the teacher in your life. He wants His words to affect your life. Every student in school has said at some point, when am I ever going to use this in the real world? If Jesus is the teacher, the answer is every day. His word should affect your life every day. His teaching must affect how we live. We can use it on a daily basis. That's what it means to be a disciple. And that is central to who we are at Canyon Springs Christian Church. Not programs, not one-time decisions, but following Jesus for life. So the disciples, they've heard the teaching, they've heard the parables, but now they're in the boat. And in the boat, it is scary. They're being tested in the face of fear and death. Look at verse 38 from Mark 4. But Jesus was in the stern, asleep on the cushion. And they woke him. They said to him, Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing? Fear can lead us to think that Jesus doesn't care. Jesus is asleep, so He's absent. He's not doing anything. He's not panicked like we are, so He obviously doesn't care. Jesus, I'm in the pit. My anxiety is overwhelming. Don't you care? Don't you see how bad things are, Jesus? Do you ever feel like Jesus is absent and therefore He doesn't care? So they wake Jesus up, and His reaction is astonishing. Look at verse 39. And He awoke, and He rebuked the wind and said to the sea, Peace, be still. And the wind ceased, and there was great calm. And then He said to them, Why are you so afraid? Have you still no faith? The disciples are really scared, but Jesus has real power and authority, and I would love to know what kind of look Jesus gave the disciples in the middle of the boat in the middle of the sea, in the middle of their fear. He looks at the wind and the waves and all of their power, and he says, be quiet. Calm down. It's a rebuke. It's a command with an implied threat because Jesus has real authority. Rebuke is what Jesus does to demons. He rebukes the wind and says, stop it. We adopted 2 children from Taiwan. They were 3 and 5, and we flew to the other side of the world to meet these 2 children that spoke no English, and we spoke no Mandarin Chinese. So my wife, who is brilliant, decides we need to learn about 10 phrases in Mandarin. So we did. We practiced and got a teacher, and we learned important phrases for worldwide travel like, do you have to go to the bathroom? All right? I don't remember most of these phrases, but there are 1 or 2 that are in the back of my mind and sometimes come out. Here's one of them. Anjing. It means be quiet and calm down. And when I'm around little children, you may hear those words come out in Chinese once in a while because, trust me, as a dad of little kids, it came out a lot. Be quiet and calm down. That's what Jesus said to the wind, and it stops. Jesus wants to tell all of the things causing you fear to be quiet. Does Jesus ever need to tell you to stop and be quiet? He's just proven he is more powerful than the scary things. That's the take-home message from today. The disciples need this reminder from Jesus that Jesus is more powerful than the things that are scaring them. Do you need that reminder? I do. He addresses the storm, the wind, and the waves. Just stop. And they do. They stop. Jesus can set you free from fear. Fear can weigh you down. It can be a huge burden. But Jesus wants to say to your fear, peace. Be still. I think Jesus has the power to slow my heart rate and slow my breathing if I will demonstrate my faith in Him in the middle of the boat. He's the teacher. He wants the students to learn. But I think they had to figure this one out after they completely calmed down later. Jesus rebukes the storm, and then He kind of rebukes His disciples. Jesus links fear with lack of faith, and I don't like that. It makes me feel guilty because I still experience fear. These guys have been with Jesus. They'd seen Him do miracles, and He says to them, why are you afraid? Do you still have no faith? The dialogue in the story is fascinating. The disciples analyze the situation and say, we are going to die. They say one thing to Jesus, don't you care? Jesus says one thing to the wind and waves, stop it. And then Jesus says to the disciples, why are you afraid? Don't you have faith? Is Jesus suggesting that faith in Him can keep us from getting overwhelmed by fear? I think maybe He is. For them, they needed to remember that Jesus is bigger. He's more powerful than the wind and the waves. They had not seen Him calm storms before this. But they had seen Him heal people and needed to have faith in who He was. For us, we need to remember that Jesus is bigger than the things that cause us fear in our family, in our country, and in this church. Maybe Jesus wants to say, calm down in the middle of the storm. I think Jesus may have been trying to teach them a lesson in the boat. I think the boat was a chance for them to exercise their faith. He had been teaching these parables. He had been teaching about faith before they got in the boat. Again, let me back up. He had been teaching them that their faith needs to be real and it needs to be visible. Faith needs to be like a seed that grows. After He tells a parable about seeds and soils, He explained it to these same disciples before they got in the boat. This is what He says in verse 20. But those seeds that were sown on the good soil are the ones who hear the word, accept it, and it bears fruit, 30-fold, 60-fold, and 100-fold. They had heard Jesus say that. Then they're in the middle of the boat. Then they're in the middle of fear, and we've been there. And that fear is a chance for their faith to grow. Instead, their first response is, we are going to die. I want to know what the next response is. When you are afraid, it is a chance to exercise your faith. Don't feel guilty about being afraid. It's a chance to exercise your faith, and it can grow. Lots of seeds are planted at church, but they need to grow everywhere. He told other parables about light. Faith needs to be visible like a light. Verse 21, he said to them, as a lamp brought in to be put under a basket or under a bed, not on a stand. Being in the boat, being in the middle of fear is a chance to say, I want better. You can all think that what I'm saying is dumb, but I want better. My faith is in Jesus. Maybe we need to respond to complaints with faith. Not blind faith that says it'll just all work out, but real faith that says Jesus is bigger than this storm. Faith needs to shine like a light in the darkness of fear, and that light is Jesus, not random good thoughts. Now, that sounds convicting to me because fear is really scary, but Jesus wants to bring light into that darkness in the middle. Don't feel guilty when you experience fear. Remember what Jesus has taught. He has taught you. Now will you trust him even in the boat, even in the middle of fear? Teacher also said this to his disciples in verse 24. Pay attention to what you hear. With the measure you use, it will be measured to you, and more will be added to you. The fear in the boat is a chance for your faith to grow. What does Jesus want to calm in your life? Do you have fear for your family? Do you have fear of change? Do you just have an underpinning of anxiety over everything? I don't know if you've seen the movies Inside Out, and there was a sequel that just came out, but they're about emotions that control a young girl. And as she's going into high school, I'll spoil the second movie for you in Inside Out 2, the primary driver of all she does is anxiety. That's not just for kids, is it? Anxiety drives many of us. And what if Jesus? What if Jesus wants to say to that driver in my head, calm down and be quiet? Might be a great prayer. Jesus, calm my fears. Will you say it with me? Jesus, calm my fears. Some of us need to say that every day this week. Next time you see a boat being pulled down the highway, next time you see a boat on the lake, will you remember to ask this question, what does Jesus want to calm down in my life? He is that powerful. He is bigger than the things that scare us. He's teaching you because he wants you to be free from fear, not just the situation where fear is real. Don't feel guilty when you're afraid. Look to Jesus who wants your faith to grow when you are afraid. In your fear, picture Jesus in the boat with you, ready to say, calm down and be quiet. Jesus is the teacher. He wants you to get it. He really wants you to be free from fear. But there's one more verse in the story. The wind calmed down. The threat is gone. Jesus has told them they can overcome fear by faith in him. Not just faith that things are going to get better. Faith in him. And now they are afraid of Jesus. Look at verse 41. They were filled with great fear and said to one another, who then is this that even the wind and sea obey him? They were afraid of dying in the storm. Now Jesus has calmed the storm. Now they are afraid of him. And may I suggest that is actually healthy. I'm afraid of Jesus, and that's the only way I see it possible for me to be free of the fear of everything else. He wants you to understand His teaching. He wants you to have real faith in who He is, because He has real power. He has more power than the things that are really scary to us, and He wants to tell your fear to calm down. And we get our fear backwards. We view Jesus as not scary and all of our triggers as scary. Jesus is scary, even if you don't hear it that way normally at church. And He's bigger than all of the things that trigger our fear. This Jesus is the one who can tell the wind to be quiet, and it does. And He wants you to have faith in Him so you're not afraid of everything else when you're in the boat. Why should I be afraid of the wind that can sink the boat when Jesus is in the boat with me? He's the one with real power. He is bigger than the things that scare us. Jesus is more powerful than the scary things. Let me read one more verse in closing. In John chapter 8, Jesus says, "So if the Son sets you free, you will be free indeed. And I need to exercise my faith that that is true." Because sometimes I have trouble believing it. Because sometimes I deal with fear. I think you want to be disciples. I think you want to learn from the teacher. Not just the one who tells stories, but explains stories and is still there with us after that when things get scary. He's the one who's with you in the boat who can say, "Be quiet," to all of your fears. And it's not easy. It's not a magic formula that allows you to snap your fingers and your fears are gone, but it is faith that allows you to be in the boat and say, "In this moment of fear, I trust Jesus who is bigger." And maybe you need to practice saying that when you are afraid. Jesus is bigger. Because the middle of your fear is an opportunity to exercise your faith, and it can grow. Will you pray with me? God, you are big, and you are good. You are bigger than the storms that scare us. God, can I admit that I'm afraid to say, "Make our faith grow," because that might put us in scary situations. But can I say on behalf of this church gathered here that we trust Jesus who is bigger than the things that scare us? May that be dominant in our lives this coming week. In His name, amen.